Hello and welcome to the virtual edition of our year-round member screening Film Independent Presents and this Q&A for the upcoming Amazon documentary All In, The Fight for Democracy. My name is Jen Wilson and I'm a senior programmer here at Film Independent. Before we get started, I need to give a special mention to some of Film Independent's loyal supporters. Thank you to our incredible lead sponsor, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, our virtual screening partner, Vision Media, our official media partner, the Los Angeles Times, and lastly, our promotional partner, KCRW. Now please welcome today's moderator, the founder of The Blacklist and a contributing editor for Vanity Fair, Franklin Leonard.
Hi, everybody. Jen, thank you so much for that introduction. It's always weird trying to sort of kick things off when there's not an audience that you can see. But thank you to you and thank you to Rachel Bremer for gathering us all together. I welcome on my behalf to Film Independent Goes to Washington, everybody. And to say at this moment that we all may need to go to Washington may be a rather significant understatement. So for right now, no matter where you are, we're all in Washington and we should be thinking about going there. We also only have like 40 minutes, 15 of which will be for your questions. So as Jen said, definitely add your questions to the chat box. But to paraphrase noted political philosopher and professional football player Marshawn Lynch, we know why we're here. So let's get to that part. We are joined today by the co-directors and producers of All In, The Fight for Democracy, Liz Garbus and Lisa Cortez, its producer, Dan Cogan, and subject of the film, Charles Howard Camley Professor of African American Studies at Emory University and author of One Person, No Vote. If you have not read this book, do fix that. Buy the book. It is available for your purchase, and you should do that, not because I'm telling you to do it, but because it's good for you. And it's good for all of us. Buy the book. Carol Anderson, Professor Carol Anderson. So I want to jump in maybe a non-traditional way. And I'm going to start with a personal question for each of you. Fundamentally, this is a film about voter suppression in the context of this election, past elections, and the stories of people, notably disproportionately women and Black women, who are at the front lines of fighting against it. But I'm also struck by the fact that this is a film about American history. Right? Like fundamentally. And in watching the film, I was taken back to my education in West Central Georgia in my high school about American history. And I'm curious if you guys could talk about what your memories are as a child being taught American history and where and how did you learn what America was? I'm going to start with Lisa. Well, no, I'm going to start with Liz because I've known Liz longest technically. And then Lisa, you're up next because I've known you second longest. And I'm going to be deferential to Professor Anderson because she's from Georgia. And so she gets special consideration. Which, Dan, means you're stuck somewhere in between.
What a softball.
I'm just here to support. It's all good.
Well, that's quite a softball. What we're taught, what does America mean? I grew up in a family of, Jewish civil rights activists, right? My father was a lawyer with the Roger Baldwin Foundation at the ACLU in the 1960s. And so it's very difficult for me to separate, what was part of my traditional education versus what was part of my family's culture. And I'm sure a lot of us feel that way. It's all a bit of a mush. This is not a direct answer to your question, but I think that, as a part of white privilege.
I want to interrupt you because I want to make sure that I'm not confusing the question. I'm not asking what America means. I'm asking, what is your memory of being taught what people wanted you to learn what America was, right? They're sort of what you come to later on in life, but like when you're young, you're told this is what America is. And I'm curious what your memories are of that. So
yeah, I totally got that. And sorry if my answer didn't seem to acknowledge my full understanding, but I guess what I'm trying to say is what I learned from my family versus what I learned in the little communist school that they sent me to it's hard to parse. But I think that for me, because of the conversations around our dinner table, I always understood, and I'm just going to talk about voting for a second, that, you know, I understood that white privilege meant you could go vote, you could cast your vote, and you could come home, and it wasn't a big event, right? In the 60s, my father represented a woman named Henrietta Wright, who 20 days after in Mississippi, 20 days after the Voting Rights Act, she went to register to vote, and she was pulled over before she could make it home for allegedly reckless driving, passing through a stop sign, brought to jail in Mississippi, beaten, and then sent to a mental institution the next day. So I understood something at an early age about how our lived experience as Americans was very different. I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, because I had, but in any case, it's hard to parse what's talked about at the dinner table versus what I was taught in school or what I learned from my peers.
Lisa, what about you?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, Liz and I are obviously have different experiences based on the outward experience, the outward appearance, but the internal one is very similar in many ways in our upbringing. Having parents and grandparents on both sides of my family who were activists on the front line, who from a very early age, you know, everybody started most recently talking about the talk that, you know, Black parents have to give their children now. But that talk didn't just start with the recent violence against Black bodies. So I had the talk at a very early age of what was going on and the differences between what I could do and what my neighbor Jill Hayward, a nice little white girl, could do. And the spotlight that was on me and the opportunities that my parents were giving to me, but the price that it came from. So I think, you know, as we've worked on this film together, what has been really amazing is to be able to interrogate our history and to use our lens of loving history, but also our personal lenses. And I think in many ways, that's a part of the tapestry and the conversation that's a part of the foundation of the film that we've made.
Professor Anderson,
question?
no, it does, absolutely. This is exactly what I'm kind of getting at. Professor Anderson, I'm curious for you, same question, but I'm also, as a professor who is now teaching history, not just in the form of this documentary, but in books, in the lecture hall, when that's possible again, I'm curious how you think about the interaction between the education that you had and the education that you're now passing along.
Mm.
They are light years apart. And so I grew up, I come from a military family, so I understood American history in that vein. But I also understood that when my father got out of the military after making a career there of over 20 years, being systematically denied the ability to buy a home where he wanted to buy a home, because that's, as the realtor said, that's not where you people live. And so automatically coming to grips with this massive dissonance between the narrative of America and the reality, and how it fractured on racial lines. That was seared in me early. And the narrative, the history that I learned was a history of, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and he could never tell a lie. And Lincoln freed the slaves. And and so it was this very kind of heroic and whitewashed history. And then when you began asking questions, which is what coming out of my community did, as a scholar, I'm going after, there's something going on here that's not being told. that we don't understand, because then we don't understand why things are so off the rails, why things are rolling out this way, because if it was really this, then this wouldn't be happening. And so when you start doing,
if America was filled with a bunch of great white men, maybe things would look different.
right. I mean, I remember in elementary school drawing a picture of senators, and they were all white balding men, because that's how I understood political power in the mid 1960s. So, yeah.
So I'm curious, given that educational background, Liz, Lisa, Dan, you guys then set about making a documentary where you're going to teach an audience about not a different American history, but about American history that is a pretty radical counter narrative to what most of us are taught in school. You know, that might be different for you because of the school that you went to, but the sort of dominant narrative about America, the one that we tell ourselves, that Professor Anderson referenced, you guys are sort of going back and saying, well, actually, this, from a storytelling perspective, because I want to talk a little bit about craft, how do you guys approach that? That's a large story to bite off as a counter narrative. Like, how do you even approach that? Like, where do you start?
Yeah, I think, you know, reading Carol's book, which was such an important primer for both of us, for Lisa and me, in diving into this history, it became very clear to us early on that this was actually a horror movie, that it was a horror movie where there's this monster who you keep thinking you've slayed his head, or you've really damaged him now, and he's really going to be slow. And then lo and behold, he rises up. He has a different face and a different mask, perhaps, but he comes back and he's doing the same damage, even though he looks different, even though maybe 100 years later. And so we really wanted, we wanted that kind of narrative tension, you know, like looking at the moment of Reconstruction and the kind of possibility that America, you know, this moment of hope that you see, only to be, you know, slashed in the most violent, you know, horrifying ways, you know, and that kind of ebb and flow, which we see again with the Voting Rights Act, and then, you know, in the early 2000s, all the challenges leading to the Shelby decision. It's that ebb and flow that we wanted to have, you know, make the narrative, give it that tension and excitement. Of course, Stacey's race, her race for governor, is a spine when we're talking about craft. But in terms of the history, we wanted to tap into that feeling. Lisa, yeah.
You know, I think what we always talked about is how the past is the prologue to this moment that we're in. You know, as we were talking in the green room, and how you started this conversation, Franklin, as we are wondering, how did we get here? And understanding the historical context for this moment really helps us to connect to what you said earlier about what were we told. We were told, we the people. We all thought that, you know, that so many people, that we've had these rights, but we've actually been denied these rights. And you know, it takes the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and in this moment now, our consistent vigilance to make certain that we are able to register, to cast a ballot, and to have our ballot counted. Like that is a continuous struggle that we as Americans, unfortunately, have and still need to be engaged in.
If past is prologue to the present, it is also prologue to the future. I'm curious about, so in preparing for this conversation, this morning when I woke up, I was like, let me check the news to make sure there isn't any new radically transforming news about a new voter suppression reality in the country, right? Like, in between last night and this conversation, it is reasonable to expect that there's going to be some new major story about the ways in which our votes are being suppressed. I imagine that you wanted the documentary to come out in such a manner that it would be available prior to the election. But where do you cut off and say, okay, we're going to stop we're done with the edit. We're not going to incorporate any more news about the ways votes are being suppressed. Then literally every week it feels like there's a new significant story. I mean, as recently as, I guess it was either earlier this week or last week, it was like, this is how many votes were disallowed in Georgia. It seems pretty clear that Stacey Abrams won the race. Brian Kemp confirmed a fraud. But when do you stop the editing process when the story is not stopping and continuing to evolve? And I guess, Professor Anderson, same thing for you as a writer about this subject.
I'll just say quickly before I pass the mic to Carol, is the story doesn't stop, but the story stays the same. You know, it's a different visage, but it's the same tactics, which are focused on limiting the scope of people who are eligible, who are able to vote.
And, you know, the first edition of this book, it emerged out of the 2016 election, where the narrative was, well, you know, Black folks just didn't show up, you know, because they just weren't feeling Hillary, you know, and so, and you know, she's not Obama. I mean, she's so not Obama. And so Black folks just didn't show up. And I'm sitting up there going, this is the first presidential election in 50 years without the protection of the Voting Rights Act.
Exactly.
It would seem to me that that would be a major variable that we need to include in this conversation. And so that's how that began for me. But as the book began to unfold, it was so clear we are in a never-ending story about the ongoing struggle for full citizenship. And the right to vote is bedrock to that. And it's bedrock because what the right to vote does is it begins to open up the kinds of policy possibilities. That means that you've got access to healthcare. That means that you've got clean water. That means that you take climate change seriously. And so when you begin to think about what the power of that vote can do, then you're shutting off and shutting down key sectors. And so I wanted to lay it out so that we at least understood how the magic trick was done. Because once I could demystify the magic, then we could begin to really take it on and not get lost in all of the smoke and mirrors.
So this is another odd question, but bear with me. I think that there's a misconception oftentimes with documentaries that are urgent, that have a certain political urgency, right? That they are somehow inartful because they are focused on the issues or they have to communicate a lot to their audience. And I've always thought that is it frankly insults the notion of art to define art so narrowly. And I also know that in order to make something that effectively communicates the ideas that you want to communicate, it requires art. Like there is an art in that. And I know that any storyteller thinks about what that means. And I'm curious, Lisa and Liz, and Dan, you too as a producer, how do you think about the art of it? Like putting aside the urgency, the brilliance of Stacey Abrams, the art of making the documentary. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that films like this often get way short shrift in that department. And I think that this one is liable to, but just because of how urgent the political reality is.
Dan, do you want to speak to that? Or, I mean, I can, if you like, or go ahead, Dan, you have it.
I think the director should speak to that question. My role as a producer is to help make things possible and get out of the way and support them doing their thing. So I think the director should answer that.
As a fellow producer, Dan, bravo, I agree.
Well, look, I share this frustration, and you know, it's interesting because I complain all the time about reviews, which so often summarize the content of documentaries. Like you'll see a doc and it'll be like a book report, not a book review, a book report. And I'm like, but what about the filmmaking, you know? And in some ways, when you are dealing with subjects like this, the filmmaking, hopefully invisible, right? And the craft is somewhat invisible. You know, I've made things that are highly stylized, in which the craft is trying to kind of announce itself and tell you something. In a film like this, it wants to almost be invisible. And I think that's about kind of taking you on this ride and holding your hand through that, through that process, and never straying, never letting you go. And when I watch a film, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a strong point of view, and I'm looking for an argument. I'm looking for a 3-act structure, and I'm looking for tension and release. And it's the same thing. I've, directed scripted films. Lisa's produced scripted films. It's the same tools that I'm trying to take in each of those edit rooms. But it is something really, I do notice this a lot, that oftentimes when people are talking about documentaries, at least the critics, they're so focused on content as opposed to craft. And it's really hard. And I think, we work really hard to make elegant narrative films in our docs.
Right, and I think that, I guess what I'm saying is that unless it's stylized, people don't unless you put the craft on Front Street, people don't respond to the craft when it comes to documentaries. And I was just curious if you guys could talk a little bit about, without showing us the seams too much, or, I'm not asking you to tell us how to do the magic trick, but on some level I'm asking you, tell us how you do the magic trick. How do you make us not think about the seams that I know rationally are there, but I'm not thinking about them when I'm watching your doc, if that makes sense?
Well, I think there's an emotion and empathy that connected us to telling this story, and we've looked to create devices in the storytelling that would amplify and not make it feel like spinach, but without a lot of cream sauce either. And I think one part of it is personalized stories, and so grateful to Carol, her so many contributions to this film, but her sharing the story of Maceo Snipes. And then us kind of saying, okay, there is only one picture of Maceo Snipes in the world that exists. How can we bring his heroic act to life and do it in a way that gives you a sense of all the dragons he had to slay? And that's when we actually found that was the first animation we did, Liz, right? With the wonderful Diana Ijaita, who's based in Berlin. So that's one little moment, pulling back the curtain of how the story, the honoring of this individual, and finding a device to elevate the scene came together.
You want to add anything to that?
Me?
No.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in docs, especially in a doc like this, it's all in the editing, and it's all in, not wasting a moment, not having an extra moment, but knowing when to breathe. It's in that 3-act structure. I'm kind of, that to me is the great joy and challenge of making docs, is creating those narratives which feel, and I hope, to have done it here with Lisa, that, to create the narrative that feels elegant, and that time is, that you're on the edge of seat, you're there for every minute, and that 3-act structure that has to sort of pay off emotionally in the end. The editing room in a doc is like the screenwriting phase in a scripted film, in my opinion.
Let's talk about Stacey Abrams. You mentioned her as the spine of the film. Can you guys tell me, so very quick story. I mentioned before I'm from West Central Georgia, Columbus, Georgia. A friend of mine from high school called me one day. We had not been in regular touch, and he's like, there's this woman you need to know about, Franklin. We're both in the Georgia State House right now, or the State Senate, and she went to Yale Law School. I think she writes romance novels. She's the smartest person I've ever met. I disagree with her on most things politically, but I'm obsessed with her. You have to be aware of her. And that was how I found out about Stacey Abrams, which was like years ago. And, you know, shout out to John Peasel, a Republican, but he has good taste in people. I'm curious if you guys remember when you first heard who Stacey Abrams was or became aware of Stacey Abrams. Professor Anderson, you seem to be awash in a memory, so I'm going to let you start.
It was early in the campaign and for governor, and they were telling the story about her, that they're sitting in the Georgia legislature and there's some bill going through on taxes, and it was murky. And so she went home that night and worked through every representative's what it meant for their district and what this new tax bill would do, and then color coded it and then handed it out to them in those color coded before. I was just like, oh, she's bad. She's bad. I mean,
I think this is the kind of behavior that John Peasel was referring to, as a matter of fact.
You know, and that's somebody who gets policy, but who gets policy for what it means for the people. And so that was my first memory of Stacey Abrams. And I went, oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And Lisa?
I was by New York friends who were going, you know, to Georgia. And I almost went to help support, but I was working on a couple of projects at the time, so that got in the way. That in their own way were fighting the good fight. But I think, you know, when I heard about this caravan of friends, I definitely started following her because they weren't the type of folks who traditionally would be leaving the comforts of their home to go knock on doors and to, you know, roll their sleeves up. And I knew that, you know, that when I saw her and heard her, that she was proof positive, and she was exactly what, beyond the South, what we all need.
Liz?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was probably not long before her governor's campaign. I didn't have any good friends giving me the tips, Franklin, but
I mean, I got lucky, man. I have another story like that about Obama. A friend of mine from college is like, there's this professor at the University of Chicago. He's amazing. I think he's gonna be president, but he's black. I don't know if it's gonna happen.
The caveat. Well, yeah, but I mean, you know, and Stacey, you know, thinking about the way that she addressed that tax bill, Carol, that you talked about. I mean, you know, she had a spreadsheet when she was in college of the things she was going to accomplish by the time she was 40, you know, including, you know, maybe 45 was being president of the United States. So I think she maybe has a year or two, but we'll give her till 50. And yeah, I mean, she's just an extraordinary mind. You know, she was a terrific partner. I mean, one thing that I think is worth sharing is that when we first met Stacey, you know, Stacey had been approached, not surprisingly, by many documentary filmmakers wanting to follow her. And she had said no. She said, you know, that was not her thing. She's not super comfortable with that camera at her shoulder all the time. And she also, and then post-race, you know, when she immediately threw her energy into fair fight and into fighting for voting rights, she was very, very acutely aware that this should not be about Stacey Abrams. You know, Stacey Abrams doesn't have the right to win an election, but every voter in Georgia has the right for their vote to be counted, every eligible voter in Georgia. And so to make it about Stacey would be to lose the forest for the trees. And, you know, Lisa, of course, and I had to push back. We had to say, we need a little Stacey, you know, we need some Stacey, we need that heart. And you know, at a certain point, she had to take off her politician hat and put on her producer hat and say, okay, guys, I see why you need that, you know, in the movie. And she went along with us. But I found it was so smart because, you know, your tendency as a filmmaker, oh, let's follow Stacey everywhere. You know, she's a huge star. She's going to be somebody. So she'll, you know, she's going to have this incredible career. Let's be with her. But she's right, because if we're releasing the Stacey Abrams film right now, it would just be all about her merits or demerits or whatever people say about her. But now it's about an unavoidable truth that affects all of us. And that was a really smart place for her to orient us, I think.
Carol, when they came to you and said, "Hey, we would like you to be a focus of this documentary," like, how was that? Like, what was that experience like? And like, how do you think about being a part of this conversation and the on-screen talent?
So let me just say, I think of myself as I'm a Poe Black child from Linden, right? And I went, so let me see if I get this right. Who's calling me? And
I mean, you were also a tenured professor at Emory University, just to be clear.
And a best-selling author.
Yeah, and on the National Book Award long list. Like, I could go on. I just, like, on some level, it's like, if they're not calling you, what are they even doing? But I appreciate your humility.
no, and it's real, because I never ever forget, and so honored, and really honored, because I wrote the book with the kind of fierce urgency of now. I saw, after the devastation of the Voting Rights Act with the Shelby County v. Holder decision in 2013, that these states have lost their minds, or to put it another way, who let the dogs out? And so we can do the woof, woof, right? And so we get this.
John Roberts let the dogs out. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes.
Right. And so this book was written with the fierce urgency of now, but the whole point is to get as many people as possible to understand what the threat of voter suppression really is, how it works, how it looks so legitimate and smooth and easy and legal, but in fact it is actually lethal. And so to be asked to be in this film, I went, oh my gosh, and then wow, what another incredible venue in order to really get the word out to a much broader audience about the toxicity and the dangers of voter suppression to American democracy. So I was honored. And so, like, going up to New York City.
It was a snowy day, wasn't it? Yeah.
Oh yeah, but it was in December. We were good.
Yeah.
It was when we used to be able to, like, really just travel.
Right, exactly.
Right. And shake people's hands when you met them. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
What we wouldn't give to be able to travel through a snowy New York City day right now. So we are coming up on time, but I want to ask one final question. What is one thing that's not in the documentary that you wish you could make sure that all of us and everybody who watches this knows before November 3rd? And I think you guys obviously, like, hit the high points, but obviously there's a lot more than can be included. Is there one thing that you would like everybody to keep in mind on top of everything else that you've already sort of injected into the dialogue about the next 55 days or whatever exactly it is?
Two things. Yes, we take you on quite a ride, but we want to be hopeful, and we want to prepare ourselves that we might not have an immediate answer on who the victor is, but we cannot lean into the disinformation and the fear that is being messaged to us. We can lean into facts. We can lean into mobilization. We can lean into community.
I don't know who's going to follow that, but. All right. I was hoping for a longer drawn out closing, but I don't really know how you follow that, Lisa. Well done. That's a great punctuation mark. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Remember, Election Day is November 3rd. Make sure to see the documentary, All In. Where's having my computer? All In, the Fight for Democracy, by Dr. Anderson's book, One Person, No Vote. and do what you need to do to engage in your community between now and then, and stay safe and take care of everybody. Wear a mask. See you guys soon.
Thanks, Franklin.